Hello, friend. Welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The bread was still warm when they found it, lying alone on the sidewalk like a final punctuation mark in a sentence no one wanted to end. That morning had risen like every other in Hawksville. Soft, slow, and laced with the smell of promise. Marlene stood by the kitchen window with a hand on her growing belly, humming a song only she and her husband understood, the tune curling through the air like smoke from old memories. Adrian, dressed in joggers and slippers, had laughed when she craved fresh bread just moments after breakfast. "Your appetite could win a prize," he teased, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "Stay put, I'll be back in 10. And with those words, casual, unceremonious, innocent, he walked out of the door and vanished from her world. Hours bled into one another, each minute wrung dry of calm. By nightfall, worry had gnawed holes into her chest, and when she called his line for the 20th time and heard the same dead tone, a chill deeper than fear settled in her bones. She called friends, neighbors, even knocked on doors, her voice trembling through tears. "Have you seen Adrian?" she asked, like a woman already speaking into the echo of loss. But no one had. The bread was found near the junction, squashed and stained. Adrian's wallet and phone weren't beside it. Just the bread. Just silence. The days that followed unfolded like wet clothes on a slow line, heavy, dragging, and exposed to every wandering eye. Marlene filed a missing person report, her fingers trembling as she signed her name, as though ink could anchor reality. The officers nodded with the stiffness of men used to grief, and short on answers. One mumbled something about adults having the right to disappear, and she nearly spat at the thought. "Adrian wouldn't leave me. He wouldn't leave them," she whispered, resting her hands protectively on her belly as if shielding her unborn from the ugliness of uncertainty. At church, the murmurs began. Some called it witchcraft. Others said maybe he ran. Even those who meant well carried questions in their eyes like unwelcome guests at a funeral. Each sunrise became a knife, each sunset a funeral. Her home grew louder with absence, his shoes still by the door, his toothbrush waiting like a forgotten prayer. She stopped looking at his photos. They hurt too much. Time slithered forward, and when the contractions came on a stormy Wednesday, she was alone, groaning in pain and screaming his name between pushes, hoping her voice might summon him back like Lazarus. But no miracle happened. Just two babies, one boy, one girl, crying into the cold light of a world where their father had become a ghost. She named them Callan and Celine, after words Adrian used to write at the end of every birthday card he gave her: "Call on me, my celestial light, always." Raising them alone felt like holding back the tide with a paper fan. There were nights she sang herself to sleep, rocking them while fighting back tears that tasted like rust and regret. Bills came like an angry mob, and soon her savings bowed under their weight. She sold their car, then her jewelry, and finally pride itself. But the fire in her didn't go out. With a borrowed oven and sheer grit, she started baking pastries, selling from door to door, until her food became a staple at birthdays and naming ceremonies across Hawksville. Plated Grace, they called it, and slowly her name carried weight again, but this time not as a wife, but as a woman who refused to sink. Still, every night, when the house settled into its quiet and the children lay curled like commas in bed, she'd hum the song Adrian once wrote, softly, slowly, as if her voice could find him, wherever he was. The twins would hum along in their sleep, their voices echoing the lullaby, like tiny lanterns in the dark. Miles away, in a coastal town called Brentwell, a man named Ryan awoke with sweat on his brow and questions in his bones. He didn't remember the woman in his dreams or the song that came and went like a tide against rock. He only knew that something was missing, a name, a scent, a truth tucked in the folds of forgotten time. 4 years earlier, he had woken up in a hospital bed with cracked ribs, blurry vision, and a mind wiped cleaner than a chapel floor. Laura, the nurse who found him bleeding by the roadside, had visited him every day. When no family came forward, she opened her home and heart to him, helping him build a life out of the ashes of amnesia. He learned to work with his hands, crafting furniture with a strange ease that suggested muscle remembered what the mind did not. But there were days he paused mid-saw, staring at nothing, his heart racing for reasons unknown. Nights were worse. He'd hear music, soft and haunting, and see flashes of faces he didn't know how to name. Laura told him the mind heals in puzzles, but each piece he found made the picture more confusing. He planned to propose soon, hoping a future might drown out the past. But deep down, some part of him, some stubborn, flickering ember, still burned for something he couldn't explain. The streetlights in Hawksville blinked like tired eyes when Marlene stood in front of her house one early dawn, holding a tray of cupcakes wrapped in cling film and hope. The twins, now nearly 4, still slipped inside with soft breaths and limbs flung in all directions like they had conquered dreams in their sleep. Marlene's catering business had become the wind beneath her patched-up wings. It didn't fall into her lap. She built it like a woman sewing her own parachute mid-fall. Each order was a chance to climb out of the pit life threw her in, and though some days felt like pushing a wheel uphill in worn-out shoes, she never let her shoulders drop for long. Word about Plated Grace had spread like harmattan fire, softly, steadily, and with purpose. But while people saw a woman thriving in flour and flames, they didn't see the quiet ache she folded into every meat pie, nor the way her eyes flickered toward the front gate whenever a male figure passed by. Her heart still had an ear for footsteps that never returned, and no matter how brightly she smiled, there was a corner of her soul that refused to sweep out Adrian's shadow. That shadow wasn't haunting. It was waiting, stubborn as dried paint on old canvas. The twins had grown into spirited children, as curious as a cat in a room full of mirrors. Callan was the more serious one, always trying to protect Celine from imaginary monsters or barking dogs, while Celine skipped through life like it was a melody only she could hear. They didn't know their father, but they knew his song, the lullaby Marlene whispered every night, the one Adrian had written after their honeymoon. "Come home to me, wherever you roam," she would sing, her voice quivering like wind on a reed, and the children would hum along, eyes fluttering shut, dreams catching the rhythm like fallen leaves on a string. It became their shared ritual, one thread that tied them to a man whose absence was now part of their family fabric. Strangely, the song gave them comfort, not grief. Sometimes Celine would hum it to her dolls, or while stirring batter with Marlene. Callan once sang it in his sleep, and Marlene had to step out of the room to cry quietly into a dish towel. It amazed her how a tune could outlive presence, how melody had become memory's stubborn twin. She never spoke ill of Adrian to them. Instead, she painted him as the hero in bedtime stories, a man who might walk in one day smelling of bread and love, holding answers wrapped in a hug. In Brentwood, Ryan stood in front of the mirror in his modest flat, staring into his own eyes like they belonged to a stranger wearing a borrowed suit. The wedding was in 3 months, and Laura had already booked the venue, her aunt's garden in Brentwood Heights, a place surrounded by trees that looked like they had secrets rooted in the soil. Laura was a good woman, kind, patient, and full of warmth. She had been his compass when he was lost at sea with no map, no name, and no direction. But lately the tides in his mind had begun to rise again. He'd dream of a woman's voice, low, steady, full of honey and heartbreak, singing a song that felt like home he'd never lived in. Once, he woke with the word Marlene sitting on his tongue like an echo from somewhere ancient. He scribbled it into his notebook and pretended not to care. But it ate at him. Laura noticed, though she said nothing. She had found him bloodied and unconscious near Brentwood Station on a rainy afternoon 4 years ago. When he regained consciousness and remembered nothing, she fed him soup, clothed his wounds, and gave him the name Ryan because he reminded her of her late brother. That name became his, and so did the life that followed. But names are only labels. The soul remembers what the lips forget, and lately his soul had begun to knock on locked doors. One evening, Ryan wandered into a second-hand bookstore near the pier, drawn by a sign that read Voices of Forgotten Time. He didn't know why he entered, but the scent of old paper and dried ink called to him. While browsing through a magazine archive from 4 years back, his hand landed on a local feature titled Plated Grace, A Mother's Rise After Vanishing Husband. The photo hit him like a slap with silk, soft but stinging. There she was, her eyes, her smile, her name, Marlene Adebayo, printed in bold beneath the article's header. His knees buckled slightly, and he sat on the edge of a creaky stool, heart hammering like fists on a locked chest. He read every line, drinking her story like a man crawling through the desert. His fingers shook as he traced the page. She had started a catering business after her husband went missing. She had twins. She had hope. Her photo stared back at him, not accusing, not desperate, just full of that quiet strength that lives in the bones of women who've learned to cry without sound. Ryan didn't tell Laura what he saw. Instead, he tucked the magazine into his coat and walked out, the cold air slicing through him like a blade made of memory. That night, he stood by the window, humming the tune he always thought was a dream, and this time, he didn't stop when Laura called his name. The invitation came on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in gold-embossed paper and the fragrance of something sweet and final. Marlene was elbow-deep in dough, her hands caked in flour, when her assistant Tara walked in, waving the invite like a fan. It was from a high-profile client in Brentwell, an engagement party for a young couple from a well-to-do family who had requested plated grace after tasting her pastries at a birthday in Elmont. "This one will change your level," Ma Tara had said with stars in her eyes. But Marlene, who had learned not to dance until the drums were certain, simply smiled and nodded. After the guests left that afternoon, she sat with her cup of Zobo and stared at the name on the invite. Laura and Ryan. There was nothing strange about the names, not in isolation. But something about Ryan made the hair on her arms stand like soldiers under inspection. She couldn't put her finger on it, so she chalked it up to exhaustion and pushed the thought aside. She had orders to prepare, twins to care for, and a business to uphold. She had no time for ghosts and envelopes. Still, that night, as the twins lay curled at her side and the ceiling fan clicked lazily above them, she dreamt of a road, a loaf of bread, and a man running toward her, but his face never cleared. The Brentwell estate was a pocket of opulence folded into the edge of the city like whipped cream on hot cocoa, sweet, rich, and not quite real. On the morning of the event, Marlene dressed the twins in matching pastel shirts with the catering logo stitched on the sleeves. They loved helping out. Callan took pride in arranging pastries with the precision of a jeweler, and Celine floated between tables like a butterfly with a mission. The journey to Brentwell was uneventful, but as the van pulled through the golden gates and up the stone-paved driveway lined with orange blossoms, Marlene's stomach turned a slow, cautious circle. "Nothing to fear," she whispered to herself, brushing invisible dust off her blouse. The garden was stunning. Marquees swayed in the breeze like sails, the scent of roses hung thick in the air, and a jazz band rehearsed in the distance. As her team set up near the far end of the reception area, Marlene caught her reflection in a polished chafing dish and paused. Behind her eyes was a question she couldn't name. The children hummed quietly as they helped set cupcakes on a glass stand, and when they broke into their familiar song, Adrian's Lullaby, Marlene felt something stir in the wind. A shift, a ripple. But she didn't turn around, not yet. She focused on her task, unaware that just a few yards away, a man had frozen mid-step, as if struck by lightning that wore the scent of déjà vu. Ryan didn't remember arriving at the garden. One moment he was adjusting his cufflinks beside Laura's car. The next he was standing under the magnolia archway, with his heartbeat galloping like a runaway horse. The tune. That tune. It wasn't in his head, it was real, floating through the air like an old perfume from a locked drawer. He followed the sound like a moth drawn to fire. And there they were, two children placing pastries on a table, humming the song he thought belonged to his dreams. The boy had his ears. The girl had a smile that cracked something open in his chest. The song swelled in his ears, each note pulling threads from a tapestry he thought had no backstory. Then he saw her. She was standing at the other end of the dessert table, pinning a satin ribbon to a display sign. Her posture, her profile, the slight tilt of her head when she concentrated. It was her, the woman from the magazine, the woman from the dreams, the woman whose name lived in the notebook beside his bed. Her eyes lifted slowly, like curtains unveiling a familiar room, and for a moment time dared not breathe. Their gazes locked. His lips parted. She dropped the ribbon. The platter beside her trembled as it tilted and crashed, frosting smearing the pristine white linen. Someone gasped. A child looked up. The air thickened as if history itself had stepped into the garden wearing a suit. Marlene blinked. Once. Twice. But the figure standing beneath the white balloon arch didn't vanish. She had imagined this moment 100 times in 100 different ways, at a bus stop, in a market, maybe in church, but never here, on a job, on a day when she wasn't emotionally armed for war. He looked the same, but also not. His hair was shorter, his beard fuller. But the eyes, they were Adrian's. She took a step forward, cautious, like a bird near an unfamiliar branch. The children turned to look at her, then followed her gaze to the man standing like a statue in disbelief. Callan tilted his head. Celine whispered, "Mom?" The man opened his mouth but closed it again. No sound came. He lifted his hand slightly, as though reaching for something intangible. Laura's voice called his name, Ryan, but it was the wrong name. Marlene flinched as if slapped by the sound. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, deliberate breaths, fighting panic, fighting hope. A second later, she stepped around the table, her eyes never leaving his. "Adrian?" she said, barely above a whisper, but the word cracked like thunder in a summer sky. He staggered backward. Somewhere in the crowd, a champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered. And just like that, a song hummed by children pulled a missing man back into the fire he once fled, unwilling, broken, and unprepared. He didn't move at first. It was as though his feet had grown roots and dug themselves deep into the rich Brentwell soil, refusing to carry him forward or allow him retreat. 1,000 thoughts fought in his head like restless children trapped in a tight room, banging against every wall in their scramble for release. Her voice, soft, tentative, and heavy with years unsaid, echoed in his chest. "Adrian?" It clanged against the name Ryan, like two swords in a duel. Laura was still calling, now walking toward him, her voice strained, her steps stiff like someone marching into a courtroom. But he couldn't tear his eyes away from Marlene. She looked both familiar and foreign, like a dream you almost remember, but slips through your fingers when you wake up. Her eyes shimmered with something more dangerous than anger, recognition. It was the look of someone who had cried rivers, planted gardens in their grief, and still found the strength to bloom. He wanted to speak, to say her name back to her, but it felt like his tongue had forgotten how to form the syllables. Behind her, the twins watched in stunned silence, their hands still sticky with frosting. For a wild second, Adrian wondered if the entire party had dissolved and he was just standing inside the echo of a memory that had finally chased him down. Laura stood to his left now, one hand brushing his arm like it could ground him, like it could erase what had just unraveled. "Ryan, say something," she said, though the firmness in her tone carried a note of pleading. Her eyes darted from Marlene to the twins, and then to the broken platter on the table, as if searching for a reason to disbelieve what her gut already screamed. Adrian, no, Ryan finally spoke, though his voice sounded borrowed. I don't know what this is, he whispered, blinking rapidly. Why do I know that song? Why do I know her eyes? He looked at Laura then, guilt bleeding into the lines of his face. You told me I had no one, he added, the accusation unintended but unavoidable. Laura's lips quivered. I didn't know who you were, Ryan. You had no ID, no visitors. I stayed with you because I cared, because I loved you. The crowd had begun to murmur. The jazz band had stopped playing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Marlene's eyes flickered to the twins, and she motioned gently for them to step behind her. You're Adrian, she said again, firmer now, her voice less a question and more a claim made by someone who'd waited too long for permission to speak. You're my husband. You left to buy bread, and you never came back. The simplicity of it hit him like a stone. Bread. That was all it took to upend a life. Callan stepped forward then, slowly, as if walking through a dream. He looked up at the man whose image he had only seen in old photographs tucked behind kitchen jars and scrapbooks. Are you our daddy? He asked, and the innocence in his voice carved a silence that swallowed everything else. Celine gripped her brother's hand, unsure whether to run or cry or do both. Adrian felt something inside him shift, something long buried beginning to crack its knuckles and stretch. He knelt down slowly, his heart pounding like war drums. I don't know, he said, his voice hoarse and trembling, but I think I used to be. His eyes brimmed with water. I don't remember yet, but I remember the song. I remember the smell of cinnamon and the sound of wind chimes in a yellow kitchen. Marlene bit her lower lip, her hand shaking. You loved that kitchen, she said, her voice breaking. You painted it yourself, even though you didn't know how. Laura took a step back, her arms folded tightly across her chest, retreating without fully leaving. The children stared at him, seeing not a stranger or a ghost, but someone who wore fragments of their stories like a half-finished puzzle. And just then, like a chord finally resolving, Adrian whispered the last line of the lullaby. Come home to me, wherever you roam. The children gasped. Marlene dropped to her knees. Later that evening, after the last guest had made their excuse to leave, after the cake had been wheeled away half-eaten, and the balloons had lost their stretch, Marlene sat on a bench beneath the jacaranda tree with the twins beside her. Adrian, no longer able to claim just one name, stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, his mind spinning like laundry in a broken machine. The night air smelled of flowers and finality. Laura had left quietly, her face unreadable, leaving behind only a note that read, Find out who you are. Then come for who you love. Marlene hadn't cried yet. She sat quietly, her back straight, her eyes staring into the gathering dark. And now you've returned without a memory, without a warning, in the middle of a party that wasn't yours. He nodded. I know, he said. I didn't choose any of this. She sighed. Neither did I. The twins leaned on her shoulders, one on each side, their breathing syncing with hers like old songs overlapping. Adrian knelt again, not to beg, but to level with their eyeline. I want to remember, he said. I want to be the man you lost. Marlene looked at him then, not with resentment, not with blind joy, but with the calm of someone who had rebuilt herself brick by careful brick. Then start by coming back slowly, she said. Memory or not, you don't get to knock on the door and waltz into a life you forgot. Somewhere, someone began to hum the song again. This time, it wasn't just the children. The following days passed like mist over a river, slow, unclear, and heavy with things unsaid. Adrian stayed in a guest lodge near Brentwell Market, where the walls were too quiet, the air too cold, and the bed too wide. He spent his hours walking through old streets with a notebook in hand, jotting down things that came to him in fragments: a dog with one ear, a yellow curtain swaying over a blue sink, a green plastic chair with a broken leg. His memory had not come back like a lightning bolt, as some had hoped, but instead like drizzles after a drought, soft, unpredictable, and oddly comforting. He hadn't reached out to Marlene much beyond the few texts that said things like, "I remembered the way you laughed when I sang off-key," or "I think we used to dance in the kitchen, didn't we?" She replied only once, sending a photo of the twins asleep on her lap with the message, "They hum that song every night." He read it 100 times before locking his phone. Meanwhile, Laura had gone quiet. She hadn't answered any of his calls, and her apartment in town sat dark and sealed, like a story that chose to end mid-chapter. Adrian understood. What was she supposed to say? She had built a home on the ashes of someone else's life, and now the past had returned like a flood knocking on a borrowed door. Marlene, on the other hand, returned to Hawksville with her hands full and her heart split. She didn't speak of what happened at Brentwell, not to the neighbors, not to the children, not even to herself. Life moved on, as it must, like a song skipping over a cracked record. The twins went back to school, the kitchen reopened, and Plated Grace began filling orders again. But the hum in the house changed. It wasn't louder or quieter, just different, as though the walls themselves were listening. Callan asked questions she couldn't answer. Is Daddy going to live with us now? Why didn't he remember us? Did he still love you? And Celine, in her soft way, started drawing family portraits again, this time including a fourth figure beside the three of them, always drawn in gray. Marlene didn't lie to them. She told them the truth. He's trying, and we're trying too. At night, she found herself staring at the ceiling long after the fan had lulled the children to sleep. Her body remembered him in ways her mind no longer allowed. His absence had become her routine. Now, his presence, even at a distance, stirred a confusion she didn't know how to name. She wasn't angry, not in the way she expected to be. It was worse, she was scared. Scared of hope. Scared of what it might cost her this time if it bloomed and withered again. One afternoon, a week after the engagement party, Adrian showed up at her door without warning. He wore a navy shirt and old sneakers and carried a basket of mangoes, like someone unsure of what peace should look like. Marlene opened the door with flour on her hands and silence in her eyes. The children weren't home. They were at choir practice, and for the first time in 4 years, it was just the two of them under one roof. No noise, no buffer. She stepped aside without a word, and he entered like a man who didn't know where his feet were taking him. He placed the mangoes on the counter and looked around slowly. "You kept it the same," he said, noticing the yellow curtains, the blue sink, the green chair now glued and mended. She wiped her hands on a towel. "You built it," she said. "I didn't have the heart to change it." They stood facing each other in the kitchen where their love once boiled over like stew left too long on the fire. He looked at her with eyes that were still learning how to remember. "I don't know how to make this right," he said quietly, "but I know I never stopped loving you. Even when I didn't know who I was, I still woke up searching for someone who felt like home." Her throat tightened. "Love isn't the question, Adrian," she replied. "It's time. Can we love each other through the time it'll take to fix what was broken?" He started showing up more often after that, not every day, not all at once, but slowly, like rain teasing a dry roof. He helped with the bakery on Saturdays, washing trays, slicing vegetables, and folding pastry boxes while the twins watched him from the doorway like cautious kittens. With every visit, a new piece of his memory returned, some vivid like lightning, others faint like a whisper in a crowd. One day, he remembered the names of Marlene's favorite soap operas. Another day, he found himself singing the twins' names into a melody they instantly recognized. But what surprised Marlene most wasn't what he remembered. It was how he listened now. Before, Adrian had been full of fire, jokes, ideas, movement. But now, he listened like someone who had learned that life could snatch away a moment before the clock blinked, and she, who had hardened herself like stale bread, found herself softening again. Slowly, warily, yet undeniably. There were still boundaries. He did not sleep over. She did not wear her old rings. The children didn't call him Daddy yet, but they laughed more, and laughter in that house was a miracle in motion. One night, as he packed up the last tray of jollof rice from a client's order, he turned to her and said, "Maybe memory isn't about what we recall. It's about what we choose to rebuild." She didn't answer. She only nodded and passed him the foil wrap. It wasn't everything, but it was a start, and in a house that had once hummed only with absence, a song was beginning to return, note by cautious note. The first time Marlene allowed Adrian to walk the twins to school alone, she stood at the front gate long after they'd turned the corner. She didn't plan to. Her feet simply refused to move. It was a Wednesday morning, the sky still yawning from the night before, and the air smelt of dry leaves and old secrets. She had stood there in her wrapper and house slippers, arms crossed against her chest, watching his shadow blend into the sunlit road. It was a strange thing to let him lead, even in something as simple as a walk. But he'd asked gently, as he now did with everything. "Let me take them today," he'd said. "Just to the gate. Just to practice being part of their rhythm." And she had nodded, though her heart had flinched. Trust didn't grow like weeds. It needed watering, trimming, and days without drought. The children had grown used to him now. They no longer whispered when he entered the room, no longer watched him like a ticking clock. Callan asked him questions about animals and math. Celine showed him her drawings and insisted he always pick her up last at school so she'd get more minutes with him. And Marlene, she watched all this with the cautious grace of someone peering through a window during a storm. She wanted to open it to let the air in again, but memory had taught her that not every wind came with peace. That evening, Adrian returned with the twins in tow, both of them clutching puff-puffs he'd bought from the roadside. They chatted on about a classmate who drew on the teacher's chair and how Adrian had tied Celine's shoelace like a soldier. Marlene stood at the door, wiping her hands on a towel, her eyes not on the puff-puffs or the chatter, but on Adrian's face. He had a tired look, not of exhaustion, but of a man who had walked through time and finally recognized the shape of his own shadow. Over dinner, they talked. Nothing deep, nothing heavy, just school, weather, and why the rice cooker now needed tapping before it worked. And when the twins had gone to bed, Marlene poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to Adrian, then sat beside him on the front steps. The stars blinked down like old friends pretending not to stare. "You remember more these days," she said, sipping slowly. "Not everything," he replied, "but enough to miss what I missed." She didn't speak, just stared at the moon. Then, in a voice barely above the hum of crickets, he asked, "Did you ever stop waiting?" She turned to him, her eyes steady. "I stopped hoping," she said. "But some nights, when the wind carried that song, I left a little light on in my heart." His fingers brushed hers. "I want to earn my place back, Marlene," he whispered. "Not for the past, but for the days still coming." She didn't pull her hand away. "It wasn't a grand gesture that sealed the turning point. It was a Saturday morning like any other. The sun had painted the kitchen in gold. The kettle whistled. Celine was singing into a ladle, and Callan was sweeping flour from the counter like it was his sworn duty." Marlene stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting her head wrap, when she heard it, Adrian's voice singing the lullaby. Not softly, not shyly, but in full, from start to finish. It wasn't perfect, he missed a note here and there, but the melody was full, warm, and clear. The children joined in before he finished the second line, their voices rising like dawn over the hills. Marlene walked to the door frame and watched them. Adrian had flour on his shirt. Celine stood on a stool, leaning against his side. Callan drummed the rhythm on the kitchen table. It didn't feel like a memory. It felt like now. Like breath. Like something finally settling into place. She didn't cry. Instead, she walked in, picked up a spoon, and joined the last line. Come home to me, wherever you roam. When the song ended, the room was quiet, not with sorrow, but with fullness. Adrian turned to her. This was always our kitchen, he said. I remember now. I used to burn toast on purpose just to make you laugh. She chuckled. And I used to hide the jam so you wouldn't ruin my bread. They laughed together, not because the moment demanded it, but because joy had found its voice again. 3 months later, they stood together under the shade of the big flame tree behind the house. The twins played nearby, twirling in circles, their laughter floating like leaves in the wind. Marlene wore a simple cotton dress. Adrian had his sleeves rolled up. A small gathering of close friends, neighbors, and church choir members surrounded them, holding plates of coconut rice and bottles of malt. There were no rings, no legal documents exchanged, no fanfare, just a quiet declaration. We found each other again, Adrian had said. Not as we were, but as we are. Marlene nodded, her hand in his. This time we walked together, with memory, with loss, with love, and with bread never left unfinished. Everyone clapped, not because they were told to, but because their hearts had listened to a story that hummed like a familiar tune. That night, after the guests had gone and the compound had settled into soft silence, Adrian and Marlene sat on the same front steps with tea in hand. The twins lay inside, asleep, arms tangled like vines. Do you think this is what healing looks like? He asked. Marlene took a sip and replied, No. I think this is what choosing each other looks like. A breeze stirred the wind chimes. Somewhere beyond the gate a child hummed a familiar song. And inside that house where silence once lived, there was now only the soft echo of a promise kept, not just in words, but in every ordinary day that followed. Sometimes life sings a song we don't recognize until the silence becomes unbearable. This story isn't just about memory returning. It's about the beauty of rebuilding, one quiet act at a time. For anyone who has been forgotten, left behind, or forced to start again, you are not alone. There is strength in showing up, in folding love into ordinary moments, and in forgiving the echoes of what once broke you. Let this story remind you that closure doesn't always come as an apology. Sometimes it walks in as a changed person, asking for a second chance with trembling hands. And when healing knocks, don't rush to answer. Let your heart decide, not your history. May your days be filled with the kind of peace that doesn't shout, but whispers in the quiet. May you be surrounded by those who see you, not just for who you've been, but for who you're becoming. For every scar that still stings, may time wrap it gently and turn it into a mark of strength. If your love ever gets lost, may it find its way home through the sound of laughter and the kindness of memory. And when life asks you to start again, may grace meet you at the door, with arms wide open and a promise that you won't have to rebuild alone. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.